Our next speaker, Wendell Cox, will tell us about the highway aspects of the Columbia River crossing.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, economic growth and how it's related to mobility and land use. And what I want to do is describe something about what makes urban areas or metropolitan areas grow faster, some of the issues that are related there, relate that to Portland, and then relate it to the CRC. And let me start also by saying, in case I don't say it later, that I think you in Clark County need to understand that you represent the only urban county on the West Coast that is interested in growth. You have so much potential that it is unbelievable, and I personally think it is time that the people of Clark County begin to fashion their own future based upon a far better development model and a far better political system. Now, a lot of people like to tell you that the automobile is terrible, that it gets in the way of economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the fact is, all of the evidence suggests that the more mobility we have, the better we do in economic growth. This chart is based upon the work of Angus Madison, a late economist with the OECD, who went back and looked at economic growth from 1500 to the present. And basically you see that bottom, where over the period up to about 1820, we have a line that stays about the same. That is the highest GDP per capita of any nation in the world up to that point. The first red line is when public transit comes in. We start getting horse cars, eventually streetcars, and so on. Notice we get a big increase in GDP per capita at that point. Then the car comes in about 1900, and look what happens. The fact is, the automobile, and it's not that the automobile is such a wonderful technology, what's wonderful is what it does. It makes it possible for us to get anywhere we need to get in the urban area quickly. For economic growth and job creation, there are two things we need to do. One, we need to minimize travel times, and two, we need to do it as inexpensively as possible. Because one of the things I learned early on the LA County Transportation Commission is the public sector has no perception of money. They seem to think that money will always be there and there will always be more. We need people running our public agencies that recognize every dollar needs to be used to the best effect. Now, John told us about the philosophy of the Portland area, and the prevailing philosophy around the world, thank the Almighty that it hasn't spread all over the place, but basically cars are bad and low-density living is bad. Let's look at the facts, however. Now, first of all, remember, the most important thing with respect to economic growth and mobility is to minimize travel times. This is the data out of the American Community Survey. Says that the average travel time to work is this is median, not average, a little bit better than the average. Median travel time to work by car alone, 21.4 minutes. Median travel time in the nation by transit, about 47 minutes. Now, which do you think is more effective? If you try to get people out of cars and into transit, you're in favor of poverty because you are in favor of strategies that reduce economic growth, and that's a real problem. We can look at this chart that basically says, well, what happens if we compare how dense the traffic is, how intense the traffic congestion is based upon density, because one of the great things that the planners are attempting to do is increase densities. You can see that as densities go up, traffic densities go up as well. This is a real problem. When we slow down traffic, we increase fuel, increase fuel consumption, we make things less healthful, for example. This happens to be NOx emissions. You know, we've got a big debate going on in this country with respect to NOx emissions, and right now the Obama administration has sort of backed off on its plans, but the basic point is, you know, you are told by planners that if only we densify, if only we make our cities more dense and get out of cars, we're going to have better air quality. Not a chance. The fact is, the worst air pollution is where the densities are the highest, because that's where the cars are polluting. This basically shows a comparison of the extra time required during peak hour to travel by car in Europe versus the United States. Now, you notice in the biggest urban areas, and there are only four of them, New York, LA, Paris, and London, it's pretty close. We're a little bit better than Europe. But look at it as you go down. You find, for example, in European metropolitan areas of 1 million to 2.5 million people, that's the size of Portland. In the United States, the average person in traffic during peak hour is losing about 6% of time, and in Europe, something like 20% of time. Transit is about downtown. What this map shows you is from the corner of 100th and Holgate in southeast Portland, The green is where you can get in 30 minutes by car, and the red is where you can get by transit in 30 minutes. The basic problem is what we call the last mile problem. The problem with transit, yeah, the trains are great, and sometimes they go fast, like between, through the tunnel in the West Hills. But the fact is, you got to get to the train, and you got to get from the train to where you're going, and that's very difficult. And so if you want to have a transit system that competes with the car, you need it to look like this. You need lines every half mile. How many jobs can the average person in a metropolitan area get to in 45 minutes? And it turns out nobody even reaches 10%. Here, this map shows you what happened over the last decade. In Portland, we have the most radical densification policies in the United States, the most anti-suburban policies in the United States, and the most anti-automobile policies in the United States. You would think, therefore, that the growth in Portland would probably be toward the center. Yet if you look at that map of the Portland metropolitan area, the blue areas are where the growth was the greatest between 2000 and 2010. The other colors are a little, the growth was less. Now granted, I admit, the growth in the Pearl District was very interesting. It was very nice. The fact is, the Pearl District is so small that it's irrelevant in terms of the overall scheme of things in Portland. There is a sense, there's an approach on the part of planners also who somehow think that the only thing that counts is downtown. Yet if you look at the Portland metropolitan area, only 9% of the employment is downtown. 91% of the employment in the Portland area in 2010 is outside downtown. That 91% cannot be served by transit. Pure and simple, it isn't anywhere in the world, and it isn't in Portland. The first little pie shows you the blue part is the 7% of jobs, or maybe it's 8%, no, 9%. 9% of jobs you can get to in the Portland area in 45 minutes by transit. The 91% you cannot. On the chart right next to it, the pie right next to it, you can see that 88% of people do get to work within 45 minutes by car in the Portland area, and that includes carpools. Here is out of the Texas Transportation Institute something they call their travel time index, which is the excess time that you spend commuting during peak hour in Portland. Now, Dallas-Fort Worth is 2.5 times as large as Portland, okay? It actually has grown a lot more, and despite what your planners tell you, its density is almost as high. By the way, Houston is as well, but that's another story. Now, over the last 25 years, you notice that Portland's traffic congestion has gotten worse at a higher rate than Dallas-Fort Worth. Not a hugely higher rate, but Dallas-Fort Worth didn't do anything. And Portland spent $5 billion to try to get people out of their cars and onto transit. David Bragdon, who was the president of Metro when he left and went to New York a year ago, did an interview with the local PBS station in which he said that there are alarming trends below the surface indicating the failure to create jobs in the core of Portland for a long time. Indeed, and do you want to know why? I mean, the fact is, planners may tell you where you can't build. They cannot tell you where you must build. Now, here we get to Clark County, what I call the economic engine of the Portland area. These are the changes in jobs over the last 9 years, 2001 to 2009. See, Multnomah County down 23,000, Washington and Clackamas up a little bit, Clark up 12,000, Skamania up a little bit. Columbia and Yamhill. Now, Columbia and Yamhill are beyond the urban growth boundary. They are exurban. They're actually growing as well. But look at here. If you compare Portland, the three-county metro area, and Clark County, what you find, look at that. Clark County is really responsible for all of the job growth. It is really time that Clark County wakes up, I think, and recognizes the value that it has and what it can accomplish. Now, there are real problems with the Columbia River crossing, and my basic suggestion here, and I'm not suggesting to you these are final answers, but I am suggesting the planning process is so flawed, it needs to be started again. First of all, the whole idea of having the project go from where the bridge, the new bridge, would hit the ground on the Vancouver side up to State Route 500 is absolutely crazy. There is not a new lane in that area. There is no increase in capacity, and is absolutely unnecessary, and we could probably save a few $100 million, if not close to $1 billion, by not doing that part of the project. Another thing, if we had had a fair process, we would have studied a bridge-only alternative rather than the politically correct, ideological, religious, high-speed rail, light rail system that John Charles tells us about, and quite frankly, quite rightly is concerned about. we need to look at a bridge-only alternative. Then there's the other thing. What are we going to do when we get this wonderful light rail system? How is it going to help us in Vancouver? Well, you know, if you go down to downtown Vancouver and decide you're going to take the bus to Portland, it's going to take you 15 minutes in one direction and 23 minutes in the other direction at this point. That's the public schedule. Now, when we get light rail, it's going to be 30 minutes. Again, there we go, doing things that are going to harm the economy, not good for the public, that kind of thing. So light rail doesn't even provide us any advantage with respect to travel. And then there's this marvelous work that David Medor made us aware of this week, went on to the Oregon DOT site and found a marvelous statement, a couple of statements here, and I got copies of this so that when this week I expect ODOT to pull this down, we'll have it. With ongoing, this is 2005, Oregon Department of Transportation talking about the interstate bridge, okay? With ongoing preservation, the bridges can serve the public for another 60 years. So it doesn't look to me like there's a big problem. And the cost to replace will be between $500 million and $1 billion. I would suggest to you it's time to go back to the drawing board with an honest process, minimum cost that solves the problem. Again, going back to David Bragdon, who a year ago when he left town took special care to talk about the Columbia River Crossing project, and he was absolutely right. And I suspect there's not much that David and I agree on in this life, but we do agree on these things. He said, the finance plan of the CRC does not add up, the revenue is not foreseeable, the environmental work is very shoddy. So the CRC fails the economic tests that I have suggested. It does not minimize travel times, and it does not do what it does for as low as possible.